Hey guys, I hope you're all doing well and welcome to the Al-Rilma update. The developers behind automation Camshaft Software have given me early access to the Al-Rilma update, and today I am going to show you how we make the new engines. Well, at least how I make them. So thank you very much, Camshaft Software. It is an absolute privilege to be able to do this, so I'm absolutely loving it. So yeah, without further ado, let's go make some supercharged engines. So we are going to start out by making a late 60s, early 70s muscle car engine, and I'm honestly not sure what we should call this engine. Let's just call it the Anoli Cowl. Sounds fun. So yeah, we're gonna do this from scratch, and it's going to be a supercharged V8 motor. So yeah, it's going to be cast iron, it's going to be heavy, it's going to be just power, it's just going to be crazy, to be honest. So I reckon something like this looks okay. This doesn't seem too bad at all. It's going to be a pushrod engine, of course. Then you have your different head types. So for those who haven't seen this yet, you have eco heads, you have your standard heads, and then you have your performance heads. And the eco heads basically sacrifice power for maximum fuel efficiency and emissions. Then you have your performance one, which is the opposite, which sacrifices emissions and fuel efficiency for maximum performance. And the standard one is sort of a middle of the road between the two, so it'll be sort of okay at both. So, but we are going to go with performance. We're going to take the iron version, as there is also an aluminium version, but we're going to go with the iron version since it's cheap. We're going to give the engine a little bit of quality, and yeah, I think we just go with forged everything here. I feel like that's going to be the play with this engine, because with the forced induction, this stuff is going to get quite tested on the inside. So yeah, we're going to give the internals also a little bit of quality, and yeah, just slam the compression. As soon as we put a supercharger on this thing, I think even 7.0 compression might be a little high, which sounds ridiculous, but yeah, it is what it is. We're not going to touch the springs and lifters and the cam profiling just yet, and yeah, so we now come to the point where we can slap a supercharger on this thing, and for this engine we're going to put a root supercharger on it. And essentially what it is, it's just basically a big old fan inside of your engine that produces boost. You can almost imagine it a little bit like your desk fan, I reckon, is probably the best description I could give it. We're going to make it nice and big because we want to produce a massive amount of boost. And yeah, supercharger ratio, I think we need to actually bring that down a bit, because it's just, these superchargers aren't the most sturdy in the world, so we can't put a huge ratio on it. So for every one time this crankshaft spins, the supercharger will spin 1.6 times. If you make it too high, then the supercharger will start destroying itself internally. So yeah, we're going to give it a bunch of boost. We're going to change the tune so it's able to do a bit more on the top end. And yeah, get rid of the intercooler, because we do not need an intercooler for this, and give the supercharger a bit of quality. Now we're going to go with a carbureted setup. It's going to be a 4-barrel single carb, I reckon. I feel like that's probably the best play to make here. I'm going to stick the carb size at 100 and see if that will be enough. If not, we'll go with a twin carb or even the DCOE. But yeah, so with the lambda area, I can show you that later, but that's really interesting. So essentially, instead of having your emissions button in the bottom corner where it's just plus and minus and you go up a tick or down a tick, you now get to fine tune your lambda area, which is essentially sort of how your engine controls its stoichiometric ratio, which basically means for every 14.7 liters of air going into the engine will need 1 liter of fuel to maximize its efficiency, basically. And the larger this area is, the bigger the coverage of the power range this engine will be able to keep its stoichiometric ratio in check, basically. Lots of big words. It's very simple when you look at it for face value, but it's surprisingly complicated to explain, actually. But yeah, So we're going to give the carburetor a bit of a quality boost. And as for fuel type, we're going to go with leaded gasoline because it's the 60s and there's no real push for unleaded fuel just yet. And we're going to go with a performance high intake, and there it is, the supercharger. And I think this looks absolutely incredible. I mean, look at this thing. It is just massive. And you could make this a whole lot bigger as well if you wanted to. So yeah, I reckon we need to reduce the manifold size because it's just going to be a lot. And we're going to go with a tubular long exhaust, and we're going to reduce the size on that as well. And then I reckon we'll go with a reverse flow for the first muffler and straight through for the second. And we have a bunch of valve float. I suspect, yep, the exhaust is choking the engine quite badly. So we're going to sort that out. And yeah, let's go to the valves. Fix the valves, increase the stiffness on the springs and lifters. Slowly but surely we have an engine that's looking pretty solid. So to try and get some power out of this engine, I'm probably going to, weirdly enough, reduce compression. I'm going to put it at like 6.0 so that we have some overhead room to play with. I mean, look at that. Reducing compression gave us 50 horsepower already. And then I'm going to see if we increase the boost, if that's going to do anything. And the engine suffers from valve float again. So we're going to increase the stiffness once again. Let's give it a bit more of a sporty cam profiling to try and boost its top end power just a little bit more, because it's a muscle car engine. It's going to want to have a lot of power. And for this engine also, we're not going to put a bypass on it. So essentially all the air that's going through the supercharger is going into the engine. There is no in or out, there's no balancing, there's just straight supercharger engine, because I mean, don't really need it at this point. The engine's producing a significant amount of power. Nobody really cared about fuel economy back in those days. And yeah, so far we are looking pretty solid here. So let's see if I can increase the supercharger ratio. Nope, I guessed very well with the 1.6 there, it seems. But yeah, if I change the supercharger tune, so if I have a look here, so this will basically allow me to put a bit more boost into the engine. And I mean, it's increasing power, but it's reducing the mid-range, which is not exactly what I'm after. But I mean, it'll do the job. It's still a significant amount of power. But yeah, so let's see if the internals are okay. So the header size could be a bit smaller to try and boost some power. So if we reduce that to about 80%, then we will get pretty much maximum power. Then if we increase the exhaust diameter by just a smidgen, that'll do the same. The intake manifold's already pretty good, but one thing that isn't too good is the carburetor, which is actually choking the engine a little bit. So if we go with a twin carb, which just looks incredible by the way. I mean, look at that. It's just two carb. That is crazy. So yeah, that means we should be making a solid amount of power. The carburetor isn't being an issue anymore. If I go with DCOE, that means we have a very interesting looking setup here. I mean, look at that. What's the quad carbs? That is ridiculous. That is genuinely ridiculous. I'm not going to use this, but that is quite crazy. So I think we're going to stick with the twin carb 4-barrel, or if we go with, that is not okay. Look at this thing. This is ridiculous. But what we can do is we can put some we can put one eco carb on there. Look how adorable that is. The engine is now producing 217 horsepower, but it is it's quite efficient. Oh, this is brilliant. I'm loving this update so much. It is just so much fun to mess around with. So yeah, we're gonna go with just a 4-barrel twin carb because power, basically. Well, if we go with the dual barrel, how much does that choke the... Actually, we are about the same as we were before with the... I mean, that makes sense, actually, if you think about it. Quad 4-barrel and single carb and 2-barrel twin carb is the same size, really, so... Makes sense. So we are just going to do this, and then we're going to make it a bit smaller so that we can produce a bit more power. And then that way we will... maybe even reach 400 horsepower at this point. I mean, look at the gains we're getting in the low end now that I'm restricting the carb a little bit. That is rather impressive. Oh, that's the fuel map. That is rather impressive. Okay, there the power goes. So yeah, let's see if I lean out the fuel a bit, if we can try and squeeze a little bit more power out of the engine. And in fact, we can. I reckon we could hit 400 horsepower quite easy here. This is actually becoming quite... This is quite interesting now. Can I hit 400 horsepower with a V8 from 69? 69, yes. So yeah. Decrease cam profiling a little bit? How do I want to make power? How do we make power? So I can advance the timing, which will always give us a bit more power, but then the fuel we put into the engine is not of the correct quality. If we increase boost, that we'll gain a bit of power, a little bit more. Oh, we're getting close. We're getting close. Can I change this up? Oh, okay. There you go. So 400 horsepower is very achievable. There we go. 400 horsepower. Let's see if I can restrict it a tiny bit to try and gain a bit of torque. And in fact I can, which is very interesting. So let's try and do something like this. Nope. Something like... Actually, I can increase the quality of the exhaust because I haven't done that yet. So something like this, maybe? Oh, come on. I want exactly 400 horsepower and 465 newton meters of torque. I don't know why I'm like that. I like it to be on the dot. I am very particular about it. It's very weird. You'll notice that with almost every single engine I've made since quite a while, actually, that unless it's genuinely avoidable, unless it's genuinely not possible, then I will make everything happen to try and achieve the power that I wanted the engine to make. So looks like we're getting somewhere here. If I increase the size of this one, okay, no. Okay, this is just going to be me fiddling around with this engine now, isn't it? So yeah, all right. If I increase the compression by 1, does that actually... No, it actually decreases both quite significantly. So yeah, no, I'm just not going to touch it anymore. 400 horsepower exactly, and 465 newton meters of torque, which is just ridiculous. And with this supercharger on it, this thing could be put in a heavy duty pickup truck, it could be put in a muscle car, it could pretty much do anything. This is such a cool engine. I can't wait to be able to do a campaign series where I just go with V8 motors and superchargers and all that kind of fun stuff. It's going to be incredibly good fun. But yeah, let's move on and make a let's make a sports car engine from sort of early to late 2000s. I reckon that would be quite fun to do. And yeah, let's give that a try. Alright, so I think this engine here is going to be a 90-degree V6. I think that would be optimal for power production. So yeah, so let's make an aluminium light engine. As this is going to be a sports engine, we want to keep it light. And as for the bore to stroke, so we're going to keep the stroke nice and short, simply because this is supposed to be a high revving engine, I reckon. So yeah, dual overhead cams, quad cams. Let's go with aluminium performance heads to try and keep this engine nice and light. And yeah, so as for the internals, I'm just going to go with forged for the time being, and I will switch that out if the engine starts to complain. We will add some balance shafts to make things a little easier for just so it runs nicer, so it doesn't vibrate as much. And yeah, this is just going to be a nice sporty engine with a supercharger, which is very, very exciting. So we are going to aim, I reckon, for about 7,500 RPM, which is a lot, but this is supposed to be a nice opulent engine. Performance orientated, it's not supposed to really be focusing on reliability that much. And yeah, we're going to put VVT on all the cams, so the intake and the exhaust cams, and we're going to leave the variable valve lift alone. So I think this will add enough complexity to this engine so that it can produce a good amount of power as it goes through its rev range. Supercharger, for this engine, I reckon we're going to go with a screw type supercharger. And for this specific one, we're going to add a clutch. So basically what this means is it can activate or deactivate the supercharger depending on how much power you're requesting from the engine. So if the engine isn't trying to make a lot of power, it'll likely decouple the supercharger and it will just basically do naturally aspirated until you want a lot of power, which helps a lot when it comes to the efficiency of this engine, as it won't be restricted very much. But yeah, so far this is looking pretty good. So we're going to aim for well, I want to try and make let's make a 1.5 liter supercharger. I reckon that will be nice and big enough for this engine. It'll produce a chunky amount of power. Sounds great to me. It's going to be direct injection. It's going to have a focus, so it's going to be running on E10 fuel, which pretty much every engine at this time does at this point. And it's going to have a performance mid intake, and this box on top of here is the intercooler. So if I remove that, that is the pure supercharger. But because we're going for power, we are going to put the intercooler back on and see if we can try and eke out a bit more power with the compressed cool air that we can ram into this engine basically. As for the headers, we're just going to go with a tubular mid setup, try and keep the headers nice and short so it can fit in many different vehicles. We're going to put a high flow 3-way catalytic converter with a precat, because this is sort of the dawn of Euro 5, which was quite difficult for many manufacturers to try and get on top of, so we're going to try and do that immediately. We're going to do once again reverse flow for the first muffler and straight through for the second, because that way we can keep a nice noise. And yeah, so right now the engine is looking pretty good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and aim for about, let's say 400 or 450 horsepower. I reckon that will be nice. So if I increase the boost, it'll lower the power, but if we reduce compression, that way we should then lose power. That's very interesting. So now that we're in the modern era of things, the car produces a different, the tuning works differently on the engine, which is very interesting to see here. So if I increase the supercharger ratio, it means it should spool faster and will give us more low down power, but this is where the clutch is now activating. So I'm going to try and ignore the clutch activating as best as I can, so keep it at about 2.2 for the gear ratio. And yeah, right now this engine isn't producing as much power as I'd hoped, so let's see if I can fix that. So what's the issue? I found the issue, it's the exhaust. Almost always it's the exhaust at this point. So yeah, there we go, 400 horsepower immediately after having sorted out the exhaust, which is just crazy. Considering the other engine was a 5.5 litre V8 and this is a 2.8 litre V6. So yeah, definitely see how times have changed in terms of just how we're able to make engines and how powerful they can be over time. So yeah, let's reduce the manifold size a little bit to try and make the engine a bit more efficient, which it is very efficient considering it has a supercharger. And yeah, so far we have a really solid engine on our hands. This engine doesn't produce as much torque as the other engine, as the V8, but it produces a nice high revving, high performance sort of power ratio, which is very nice. If we increase the compression, does that fix anything? Nope. So if we keep it at about 9.0, that looks about right. Yeah, so I'm going to reduce springs and lifters to the point where it starts dipping towards the end, because I don't want the power to be right here, because you're never really going to use any of that. So I want the power to be at around 7,000 RPM, which is still quite a lot, but if we can get it a bit lower than that, that would be amazing. So yeah, let's see here, and slowly we're starting to introduce a bit of valve float, which is good for this circumstance. And yeah, so no valve float as it stands right now, at least in terms of reliability reduction. 400 horsepower, 420 newton meters of torque. So yeah, let's see if we can introduce a bit more power to this engine. So if I do this, it will introduce low end power, but if I increase the boost, we'll get more power, which is very fun. We love power. We love more power around here. So let's see how high we can push this supercharger. It is handling it really well. This engine is doing very nicely. So now it's starting to retard the ignition, so we need to reduce the compression a little bit, which will lower our engine efficiency by a bit, but it won't cause that much of an issue. So yeah, if we go for about 1.5 bar of boost, then the engine's now suffering from valve float, so we've now got to make the valves stiffer again, because as we're adding more power, the valves are under a lot more stress, which which will introduce the valve float. And now we are looking good. We're producing nearly 460 horsepower from this engine, which is ridiculous, especially on E10 fuel. So yeah, let's have a look how our internals are doing. in terms of restriction, the exhaust is being a tiny bit restrictive. So if we increase that, we should not really, well, we don't really see much of a difference. It wasn't going to be a big difference anyway. So I will reduce that just a bit, just to get a little bit more torque out of the engine. And this is a really straight power curve. This is a very drivable engine, which is very, very nice to see. So yeah, let's reduce the fuel mapping a bit to try and introduce a bit of efficiency into this engine. And once again, let's see if we can increase the gear ratio. Is that something we can do with this clutch? Nope. The supercharger immediately says no to that. So yeah, let's increase boost a little bit. And at this point, we are sort of at our boost limit, which, yeah, it's not that great at this point. We're not seeing as much gain in terms of how much power we're making. But one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to reduce the supercharger ratio, so we lose a bit on the mid end, but we will gain on the high end. So right here, this looks all right. 460 horsepower, 490 newton meters of torque. This engine is going to be an absolute beast in any sports car you put it in. I am very happy with how this has turned out, and it's that simple to make an engine like this. I mean, with a turbocharger, it's also, you probably can make more power, especially on the top end, but you will never have a graph that looks this smooth. It is just beautiful to see. So as the exhausts are now being a bit restrictive now, we are going to increase the size, and we're actually seeing a little increase in performance. So let's reduce the header size, as we can still do that a bit. And you know what, if I can get 500 newton meters of torque out of this engine, that would be phenomenal. So I'm going to aim for that. And if I reduce this, it'll start to choke the engine out a little bit, but it will give us more torque, which is exactly what we're after in this circumstance here. So we are actually nearing the 500 newton meter bar, which is quite crazy to think about. Can we get exactly 400? Ah, we're very, very close. If I reduce the fuel mapping by just a tiny bit, nope, that ruins it. If I increase a bit of lambda, no, basically this is just for fuel economy, but it does change the power that your engine makes, I believe. Yeah, so it changes the amount of torque and power from the low end. And this is simply because if you look at, I believe it's, which graph is it? The fuel map, exactly. Now, I'm colorblind, which makes this very, very difficult, but I can still see the edges of the different shapes here. So if I go to absolutely zero, you can see that there is a very, there's nothing really going on in terms of restricting how much fuel goes into this engine. It's always going to focus on making power, so it's running very rich right now in the lower RPM limits, and as it goes up, it'll start to lean out, which means that there is less air. There's more air in there going into the engine. There is fuel from the stoichiometric 14.7 to 1. So basically what this means, it'll produce a lot of power up here, and no, it'll produce a lot of power down here, but down up here it's starting to basically choke itself out, if that makes sense. So it's starting to introduce more air than it really needs. So if we increase this to say 50%, you can now see that down here it is starting to get closer to that 14.7. So this is where you're getting your maximum emissions, where the emissions are very, very happy. And up here it is still at 11.6, but it is way, the difference is way further up to the power. So up here it's just focusing on power, down here is now focusing on emissions. And if I push this all the way up to 100, the limit is very much coming very close to the top end of this engine, which for this engine itself, for this engine, is not something we particularly want. We want this engine to be nice and torquey and nice and powerful. So I'm going to reduce that again to about 20, which will bring the entire fuel map all the way down. And that means down here it's running nice and friendly for the emissions, but up here it's running for power, and in this intermittent area it'll work very nicely for this engine. So yeah, let's see if I can get that mystical perfect number for the 460 and oh no, that's ruined it, and 500 newton meters of torque. I am like that, I am very annoying, I know. And there we go. All I had to do was increase the quality and reduce the header size by 1, and we are happy. So now we are producing exactly 460 horsepower, 500 newton meters of torque with pretty decent engine efficiency, I must say. This is really, really good, and the service costs are really nice and low, but the actual material costs are quite high, which is most likely down to the supercharger and the fact that I made this thing purely out of aluminium with forged internals. So yeah, it makes sense. but at least once you buy this engine, it won't cost you a lot to keep it fixed and stuff. And even then, the reliability is still over 70, which is very, very good. So yeah, I'm very happy with this engine. So let's go and have a look if we can make another engine using the centrifugal supercharger. So as for the centrifugal supercharger, I think what we're going to do is we're going to try and make a GR Yaris competitor engine. So the GR Yaris is a 1.6 litre engine. I'm not entirely sure on its specification, but I'm just going to increase the bore a little bit and try and get it close to that mystical 1.6 litre, which I believe is about there. So this is going to be my version of a competitor's engine. So it's going to have dual overhead cams, aluminium performance head. It's going to be very light engine, very expensive, but a very light engine. As for the internals, once again, I'm just going to go with forged, and then if I need to change it, I will, because the supercharger is going to introduce a lot of stress on this engine, so I don't want it to basically tear this engine to shreds if I'm using cast components. And yeah, this is really interesting as well. So I'm going to reduce the compression a little bit as well. We're going to make this a much more modern engine, say 2018. So that way we can have a nice modern engine in this thing. So this is going to have variable valve timing as well, and increase on the cam profiling, and it's going to have an RPM limit of 8,000 RPM. Because this is a tiny engine, it should very much be able to do that. So yeah, this is looking like a very nice engine so far. So we are going to go with a supercharger, put a centrifugal supercharger on there, and we're going to install a bypass as well, which basically means any overboost or stuff like that, it will be basically evacuated. It's almost like a wastegate, I imagine it to be. I might be wrong, I'm not very good with superchargers, I just like them. So don't take that as fact. That's what I imagine it to be doing. So we're going to put a nice big supercharger on there. We're going to put a nice quick pulley on there, which means it's spinning 15 times faster than the crank is spinning. Give it about 1.3 bar of boost, and yeah, I have to come back to that. I'm not sure if this is going to work just yet, but that's sort of where I imagine the ballpark figure would be. Direct injection in this engine, it's going to have just basically the modern stuff on it. And as for the exhaust, it's very much going to, for the actual fuel type. So this is once again going to run on E10 fuel, like almost every engine at this time does. It's going to have a performance intake. Can I get away with a performance intake from size? I mean, it's very big. Yeah, you know what? I'm going to go with a performance intake. Performance mid seems about right. So yeah, we're going to also go with the tubular mid exhaust, which I think will be the best for this engine. And because it's a supercharger, there is nothing restricting it. So yeah, high flow 3-way cat, reverse flow, and we're going to put a baffled second muffler on it simply because we want this engine to be quiet to meet regulations and stuff. And even then it's quite loud. So yeah, so far we are looking very good. How are we looking in terms of restriction? The exhaust is obviously restricting this engine once again like crazy. So let's reduce the headers as well, so that we get sort of a ballpark figure in terms of where the restrictions are going to be. So right now this is looking okay. The manifold is a bit choky, but we can increase that, so that's fine there. And yeah, so let's reduce the springs and lifters so that we can get a much more reasonable power graph. And yeah, let's have a look. So 250 horsepower as we sit right now, which is all right, but the torque is quite low, which yeah, is not great, but we can manage this. So let's increase the compression a little bit, as I'm suspecting the engine has some underutilized octane, which it does. So you know what, I'm going to keep it at 9.0, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce a bigger supercharger. Does that have more power? It does. The engine is now suffering from valve float, which yeah, sort of a back and forth thing. So let's increase the size of the supercharger. And the valves are floating again, but I can live with that. I would like to see if we can get 300 horsepower out of this engine. That would be amazing. So let's increase the springs and lifters again. And yeah, let's see if we introduce more boost, if that'll fix anything. Nope. If we reduce this, it'll reduce the power, but it'll add a tiny bit to the mid-end, which is not really that spectacular. So I'm just going to increase the supercharger tune, which is going to just give us a mad amount of power. And if we increase the supercharger ratio, that means it'll spin sooner, which will give us more power in the mid-end. Which, how is this engine coping with this? This is fantastic. So let's give it a really nice early spool so that it can go really nice and high. And then, yeah, okay, this is crazy. How's this doing it? Okay, we're getting a decent amount of torque now. I say decent amount of torque, we are getting a ridiculous amount of torque to power. So if I increase the supercharger ratio, so the supercharger is now spinning 18 times to the crankshaft's 1 time, we now get 285 horsepower and 312 newton meters of torque. So if we increase the supercharger size again, it's not actually doing very much now. So we're actually reducing power, which is quite interesting. The exhaust has been once again quite restrictive, so I'm going to increase the size on that, and I'm going to increase the header size here. And now we are just trying to find a way to get about another 20 horsepower, which shouldn't be too difficult if we increase the boost a bit. So now the engine's starting to retard its ignition, so we're going to reduce the compression, and we are nearly at the magical 300 horsepower mark, which is crazy. Oh, there you go. Done. So now I am going to focus on getting a bit of engine efficiency out of it. So if I choke it out a little bit, that means we'll add a lot of torque to this engine. But we will basically take away a bit of the horsepower, which is honestly perfectly fine by me. So let's reduce the header size, which will give us a nice mid-end boost on the torque. And there we go, we're getting close. If I can get 330 newton meters of torque and sort of 300 horsepower, then I'll be very happy. So if I increase the stiffness on the springs and lifters, we'll get a bit more high-end power. So peak power is starting at 6,500 and lasts to 7,500, which is very nice to see. So if we actually take away a bit of fuel, that means we should gain a little bit of power, which basically means we're leading out the engine a little bit. And yeah, so let's have a look if we can get that nice amount of torque and power to the engine, and it appears that we are really choking this engine out right now. So we are not going to be able to do it like that. Yeah, so this is just me fiddling around with the engine again. 302 horsepower, 228 newton meters of torque. If we reduce compression, then oh, look at that, we have a nice amount of power. So if we now take away a bit on the manifold, we should choke this engine out a tiny bit. And then what I'll do is I'll take away one from the header size, another one. Okay, there you go. And now I've got to figure out how to get a little bit more torque out of the engine. So if I reduce the springs and lifters, we're going to introduce valve float, which is not what we're after. And yeah, so now let's reduce the fuel map a bit, which really isn't doing much for us. But if we... yeah, this is becoming quite difficult now to try and balance, which it's just me being weird. But yeah, I'll have a little toy around with this engine as it's just fiddling around. But you know what, this is fine. I'm happy with this. 300.4 horsepower and 330 newton meters of torque. Absolutely incredible. This would be a GR Yaris Beta, which is just crazy. I'm very, very excited. So yeah, these superchargers are just incredible. I'm having an absolute blast playing around with them, which is just so exciting. So yeah, I hope you guys have an amazing time playing around with this update when it comes out. And yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and bye-bye.